Ilara Devereux sat alone in her studio, a vast, silent room filled with ivory keys and stacks of unfinished scores. The world outside felt so far away, muffled by the thick walls of her sanctuary. Yet, for the past week, her mind had been consumed by a melody she could not ignore, a haunting, melancholic tune that seemed to pulse with an energy beyond comprehension. It wasn't her creation. It was something older, something that had been waiting for her, perhaps for centuries. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. Each note was like a whisper in her soul, beckoning her to listen, to understand. There were no lyrics, no words, only a feeling, an anthem of defiance that made her heart race and her hands tremble with anticipation. The music was both a warning and a promise, a declaration that something was about to change. She ran her fingers across the keys, replicating the melody in its simplest form. The piano responded, as if it had been waiting for her to uncover it, to bring it to life. The notes flowed effortlessly, but the music was more than just sound. It was a signal, a beacon. And she had no idea who it was meant for. All she knew was that it was important. The world needed to hear it. But just as she began to get lost in the flow of the music, the sound of a distant rumble shook her out of her trance. A chill ran down her spine as the door to her studio opened with a creak. Standing in the doorway was her brother, Corin, his expression grim. "Ilara," he said, his voice tense. "We need to talk." She stopped playing, her fingers hovering above the keys. The melody was still there, haunting her thoughts, but the world outside was intruding once more. She turned to face him, the urgency in his eyes reflected in her own. "What's wrong?" "There's a message from the colonies," Corin said, stepping into the room. "It's a warning. The Xorith are making their move." Ilara's stomach tightened. The Xorith Empire, their name alone was enough to send shivers through the bravest of hearts. For centuries, they had ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, crushing any resistance, any hope of freedom. And now their shadow was looming over humanity once more. The colonies. Ilara repeated, her mind struggling to process the implications. "But we've been out of contact with them for years. How could they be?" "The Xorith have found them," Corin interrupted. "They're hunting down the last remnants of humanity." The message was intercepted, encrypted, but clear enough. "They know about us." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. About the song. Her brother nodded. "They're not sure what it is, but they're coming for us, for you. They know we're starting something, and they want it stopped." A flash of fear gripped Ilara's chest, but she pushed it aside. This was bigger than her, bigger than any individual. The anthem was not just a song, it was humanity's last chance. If the Xorith knew about it, that meant it was more powerful than they realized. "You need to go," Corin urged, pulling her from her thoughts. "The Xorith won't be merciful." Ilara stood, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had no choice but to act. The song had awakened something in her, and it was no longer just a melody, it was a battle cry. She grabbed her coat and headed toward the door, her resolve hardening. "We'll need to spread the song," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "It's the only way to fight back." Corin's face softened for a moment, but he nodded. "I'll contact the resistance. It's time we stopped hiding." As they hurried into the cold night, the first notes of the anthem echoed in Ilara's mind, louder than before. She wasn't sure what was to come, but one thing was clear: the war for humanity's future had begun. The cold wind cut through the streets of New Haven like a blade, but Ilara barely noticed as she followed her brother through the labyrinth of alleyways. The city, once bustling with life, now felt like a forgotten shell, its streets darkened by the looming shadow of the Xorith Empire. It had been years since the last true rebellion had sparked a flame in humanity's heart, but now that flame was beginning to catch once more. Corin led her to a hidden underground entrance, a narrow door wedged between two abandoned buildings. He paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The resistance had been working in the shadows for years, careful not to draw attention, but their efforts had been scattered and ineffective. Now, it seemed, something had changed. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and old books, the kind of place where plans were made, lives were risked, and every whispered word could mean the difference between life and death. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with maps of the galaxy, each marking the ever-shifting front lines in the fight against the Vdorith. But despite the odds, the people gathered here weren't just survivors, they were fighters. "Elara, you've brought us a song," a voice called out from the shadows. A tall man stepped into the light, his face hardened by years of war. His name was Ryan, and his reputation as one of the fiercest resistance leaders in the galaxy preceded him. "This song, it's more than just a melody," Ryan continued, his voice low, but filled with purpose. "It's a call to arms. It's exactly what we need." Elara felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never imagined her music would be anything more than a personal expression of her soul, but in the hands of these people, it had become a symbol of something much greater. The anthem had stirred something deep within her, an instinct to fight, to resist. She had never imagined she would be standing here, on the front lines of a war she could barely comprehend. "What are you planning?" Elara asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her chest. Ryan's eyes gleamed with resolve. "We've got a chance now. The Aerith are overextended. The colonies, though fractured and scattered, are starting to push back. There are more of us than they think. But we need a spark, a rallying cry. This song of yours could be that spark. If we can broadcast it to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, it'll remind every human who hears it what they're fighting for." Elara nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. But she knew the danger. If the Xorith discovered what they were doing, they would wipe out everything. The song was powerful, yes, but it was also a beacon, one that could be tracked, one that could lead their enemies straight to them. They had to be careful, subtle, precise. "We'll need to spread the anthem to every corner of the galaxy," Corin said, his voice firm with the weight of their responsibility. "But we can't do it alone. There are old allies out there, ones who fought with us during the early days. We have to reach them." Ryan turned to Elara, his expression serious. "We need you to perform the anthem live. We can use local frequencies, send the broadcast to key locations. You'll be the face of this revolution." The weight of the task pressed heavily on Elara's chest, but she could see the fire in the eyes of the people around her. They weren't just waiting for someone else to act. They were ready to rise. And the anthem wasn't just a creation anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever dreamed of a free future, a future without the crushing weight of the Xorith Empire. "I'll do it," Elara said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We'll make them hear us." As the resistance made their preparations, Elara stood at the center of the room, the anthem reverberating through her mind like a heartbeat. The Xorith might have dominated the stars for centuries, but humanity's song was about to make them tremble. She only hoped it wouldn't be too late. Outside, the sky above New Haven remained dark, but Elara could sense a shift. The song was out there now, waiting to ignite something in the hearts of those who had lost hope. Somewhere, across the vast expanse of space, the first notes of humanity's defiance would begin to echo. and nothing could ever silence them again. The Resistance was a well-oiled machine, at least it had to be. Every moment counted now. Ilara had barely slept in the past 2 days, barely eaten. Instead, she had focused on perfecting the anthem, ensuring it resonated with the raw emotion and power needed to fuel a galaxy-wide rebellion. As she sat before an array of communication equipment, surrounded by engineers and strategists, her heart raced. This wasn't just a performance. It was the beginning of something far bigger than any of them. The plan was simple but risky. They had to broadcast the anthem to key colonies and resistance outposts, places where the message could ignite the spark of revolt. Simultaneously, they would encrypt it to prevent the algorithm from tracing the transmission back to their source. Every second, every note had to be executed flawlessly. Any mistake could spell disaster. "Ilara, we're ready," Corrin said, his voice filled with urgency. "The satellites are aligned. The frequencies are locked in. Are you sure about this?" Ilara gave him a tight nod. "We don't have a choice. The galaxy needs to hear this, no matter the cost." She could hear the hum of the broadcast system coming to life, the quiet murmurs of the crew as they made final adjustments. Ryan stood to the side, his eyes scanning the room, his expression intense. There was no turning back now. "Take your position," Ryan instructed, and Ilara moved toward the center of the room, where a sleek, transparent stage had been set up, the backdrop a holographic display of swirling stars and distant planets. It was designed to make her performance seem larger than life, to remind those listening that this was the beginning of a galactic revolution. As Ilara settled before the mic, her hands resting on the polished surface of the piano, she took a deep breath. The music had been haunting her for weeks, its melody and rhythm imprinted in her very soul. Now it was time to give it life, to give it power. 5 minutes, one of the technicians called out, breaking the silence that had fallen over the room. Ilara closed her eyes, letting the familiar notes fill her mind. The anthem wasn't just a song, it was a weapon. Each chord would cut through the darkness of oppression. Each verse would rally those who had been silenced, those who had been waiting for a sign. They would hear, and they would rise. The final countdown began, and Ilara's fingers hovered above the keys. A light dimmed over the stage, and then silence. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the quiet before the storm. The entire galaxy, in a sense, was listening. If she failed, they would all pay the price. 3 minutes, the technician's voice echoed through the room, and Ilara opened her eyes. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if they couldn't overcome the Xorth? What if her music wasn't enough? The song was powerful, yes, but it was also a risk, a symbol of defiance, but also a target. But then she remembered the people she was fighting for, the colonies, the scattered remnants of humanity. The anthem wasn't just her song anymore. It was their anthem. It was their declaration of freedom, their last stand against an empire that had crushed everything in its path. Ilara took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. 2 minutes, Corrin called, his voice now firm with certainty. The speakers crackled, a signal that the transmission was about to begin. A softcom rose from the broadcast system, filling the room with a sense of anticipation. Ilara placed her fingers on the keys, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The world, the Xorth, the resistance, they all disappeared. There was only the song. It was time. The first notes of the anthem echoed through the room, resonating with the raw power of human defiance. It began soft, haunting, like a whisper from the depths of space, but slowly it grew, swelling into a powerful crescendo. Ilara's voice joined the melody, raw and emotional, carrying the weight of generations who had lived in the shadow of tyranny. As the music filled the air, the world beyond New Haven began to listen. The song carried across the galaxy, reaching far-flung colonies, hidden resistance cells, and scattered ships on the run. For the first time in years, humanity had a voice that could not be silenced. The Anthem of Defiance had begun, and its echoes would be felt everywhere. The anthem reverberated across the galaxy, its notes carrying the promise of rebellion into the farthest reaches of space. For Ilara, it was like nothing she had ever experienced. As her voice rang out, the room around her faded into the background, and for a brief moment it felt as if she was connected to something much larger than herself. The music flowed through her veins, each chord a strike of defiance against the oppressive silence that had held humanity captive for so long. But as the last note of the first verse rang out, a tremor rippled through the Resistance's underground base. The technicians scrambled, their fingers flying over their consoles, checking systems and rerouting signals. "Ilara, we've got a problem," Corrin shouted, his face pale as he rushed to her side. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic that had begun to rise within her. "It's the Galrith," Corrin replied, his eyes glued to the screens in front of him. "They've detected the broadcast. They're scrambling their forces." Ilara's heart sank. The Galrith had vast resources at their disposal, and their reach was nearly limitless. If they were able to trace the source of the anthem, it would be a matter of hours before the entire resistance was wiped out. But Ilara couldn't stop now. The song had already begun, and it was too late to take it back. "We need to move now." Ryan's voice cut through the tension. "Ilara, finish the broadcast. You can't stop now. The colonies are listening. We need to make sure they hear all of it." Ilara nodded, her jaw set in determination. She had to finish what she had started, no matter the cost. There were too many people depending on her. She couldn't let the fear of what might come stop her now. As she returned to her place at the piano, her fingers trembling but resolute, the room around her fell silent. Every eye was on her as she prepared to sing the next verse. The transmission was still live, and she could only hope that the encrypted signals would keep the Galrith from pinpointing their location long enough to see this through. The second verse of the anthem began, slow and deliberate, as Ilara poured her heart into every word. The resistance workers in the room held their breath, knowing that the consequences of failure were dire. They were relying on her to complete the broadcast, to ensure that the anthem reached its full potential. Out there, in the vast expanse of space, the anthem was beginning to stir something in the hearts of humanity. A spark. A long-forgotten desire for freedom. Ilara could feel it as she sang, the weight of her own conviction lifting her as she poured everything into the song. This wasn't just her fight, it was everyone's fight. Across the galaxy, the anthem's reach was expanding. Resistance cells on the edge of the known universe were hearing it for the first time. Some were hesitant, unsure if they could trust it. But others, those who had suffered in silence for so long, felt the power of the song course through them. The anthem awakened something primal in them, the desire to fight back. In a distant colony on the edge of the Orion Belt, a group of rebels huddled around a flickering screen. They had been on the run for years, hiding from the Galrith, and they had all but given up hope. But now, as the anthem echoed in their ears, they stood a little taller. The weight of oppression that had crushed them for so long was beginning to lift, and for the first time in years, they felt something akin to hope. "Is it really happening?" one of them asked, disbelief in their voice. "Yes," another replied, tears welling in their eyes. "We're not alone anymore." The anthem was more than just a song. It was a signal. A sign that humanity had not forgotten how to fight, how to resist. And as the broadcast continued, as the last verse swelled in power and emotion, Ilara's voice grew louder, stronger. Her defiance was no longer just her own. It belonged to every rebel, every survivor, every soul who had been crushed under the weight of the Xorith Empire. Back in New Haven, the Resistance was preparing for the inevitable assault. The Xorith had undoubtedly already dispatched their warships to hunt down the source of the broadcast, but it didn't matter. They had already awakened something unstoppable. Even if they were forced into the shadows once more, humanity's defiance had already begun to spread. The anthem had been heard, and now the galaxy was listening. Ilara's final note echoed through the Resistance's makeshift headquarters, and for a heartbeat the world stood still. The anthem had been sung, the broadcast complete, but the aftermath of her performance was far from silent. The room buzzed with an energy that was both chaotic and charged, a mixture of anticipation and fear. Did it work? Corrin's voice cracked through the tension. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. "We'll know soon enough," Ryan said, his gaze fixed on the monitors. The data streaming in was coming fast, like a torrent that no one could control. There were signs of widespread transmissions, resistance cells, remote colonies, and even hidden outposts had received the anthem. But that wasn't enough. The true test would be what came next. "Ilara," Ryan continued, "the Xorith fleet is moving into position. They're already beginning to lock down key systems. They'll be here in less than 12 hours. Her throat tightened. Every second they had to act was precious. But the anthem had done something they hadn't expected. It had sparked an undeniable surge of defiance across the galaxy. Rebels who had lived in the shadows were now stepping forward, taking the first steps toward resistance. That spark, that fire of hope, was growing. "Get the encryption codes in place," Ryan ordered, his voice steady despite the situation. "We need to keep this momentum going." Ilara stepped back from the piano, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had known the stakes, but now that the first wave of the anthem had spread, it felt like there was no turning back. For the first time in years, humanity was waking up to its power. The Xorith could not extinguish that flame, no matter how hard they tried. Across the galaxy, pockets of rebellion were stirring to life. In the Corva system, a shipyard that had been a major supplier for the Xorith war machine suddenly erupted in flames as a sabotage mission was set into motion. Workers, many of them slaves, had been listening to the anthem in secret, and now, armed with nothing but the tools they had at hand, they tore through their oppressors. The first shot was fired in defiance, and in the ensuing chaos, dozens of vessels meant for the Xorith military were destroyed. In the remote Trian Belt, a mining colony that had once been little more than a labour camp for the Xorith found itself under attack by its own inhabitants. The workers, long silenced by fear and brutality, had found their voices in the anthem, and now, armed with the stolen weapons of their oppressors, they fought to reclaim their freedom. Even the Xorith, in their arrogance, had underestimated the power of a unified people. They believed they had crushed humanity, that they could suppress every uprising with their vast fleets and iron grip on the galaxy. But they had failed to recognize one crucial truth: the human spirit could not be broken by force alone. Ilara watched the surge of transmissions continue, seeing the results of their work unfold before her eyes. There was no stopping it now. The galaxy was waking up. The anthem had planted the seed of rebellion, and it was spreading faster than the Xorith could control. "We need to get ready," Ryan said, his voice low, but full of resolve. "The real battle is coming. We've made our mark, But now we have to prepare for the retaliation. Ilara nodded, her mind already racing through the countless possibilities. The resistance would have to move quickly. But she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope growing stronger within her. The Anthem had done more than just broadcast a message. It had ignited something. It had united people across the galaxy, awakened them from the nightmare they'd been living. They were no longer alone. The fight had only just begun. But this time, humanity would not be silenced. And the Xaureth would learn too late that the power of unity, of defiance, was far stronger than any fleet they could send. The calm before the storm was always the hardest to bear. Ilara felt it now, an almost unbearable stillness hanging in the air. The Anthem had done its part, sparking the fires of rebellion across the galaxy, but the Xaureth were coming. Their fleets were massing, their weapons poised to strike. And every moment they delayed was another moment of danger, another moment where the fragile resistance could be crushed under the weight of their wrath. "They're getting closer," Corrin said, his voice grave as he watched the readouts on the monitors. "We've got reports from all over, but the Xaureth forces are organizing a full assault." Ilara's fists clenched. The fight had never been meant to be easy. She had always known that Xaureth would retaliate. But even with the surge of defiance and the resistance cells growing stronger by the minute, she knew this wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a fight for the future of humanity itself. The good news is, Ryan interjected, looking over a map of the galaxy, we've got allies. The Trian Belt miners, the Corva shipyard workers, they've joined us. They've even started taking over nearby supply routes. We're gaining ground, but it's still not enough to stand against the Dorith fleet. We need more time. Time, Ilara murmured, her gaze fixed on the shimmering stars outside the station's observation window. Time for what? To gather our forces, Ryan answered. To make sure the people who heard the Anthem know they're not alone, that we can fight back. We need to organize every cell, every rebel. If we're going to stand a chance, we'll need to unite the galaxy like never before. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. She thought back to the moment the Anthem had first echoed across the stars. She had thought it would be a simple broadcast, a statement of resistance, but it had become something more, something far greater than herself. It had awakened a movement. And now, she realized, that movement would be tested in the crucible of war. We can't wait for all of them, Ilara said, her voice steady, but with an edge of steel. We can't wait for every single cell to rise up. We have to act, and we have to act now. Agreed, Ryan said, nodding. But we need a plan. We can't just rush in blind. Ilara turned toward the command table, her mind already forming the plan. There's a refinery on Gorth Prime, she said, tapping a spot on the map. It's one of the biggest Soreth fuel suppliers. If we can hit that and cripple their supply lines, it will buy us some time. They won't be able to move their fleet without fuel, and we can use that opening to make our next move. Corrin frowned. It's risky. The refinery's heavily guarded, and the Xaureth know about the uprising. If we go in now, they'll be ready for us. Ilara met his gaze. They'll always be ready for us. But we can't afford to wait any longer. If we don't act now, all of this, the Anthem, the rebellion, it won't matter. The galaxy will be crushed under the heel of the Xaureth, and humanity will never know what it's like to be free again. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they had worked for. They were at a crossroads. Every decision from this moment forward could mean the difference between victory and defeat. We move at dawn, Ilara said, her voice resolute. We'll hit Gorth Prime. The resistance cells will follow our lead. It's time for humanity's defiance to be more than a song. It's time to take action. The room fell into silence, the tension palpable as the plan was set into motion. Outside the window, the stars gleamed with the quiet promise of change, but within, the storm was already forming. The Atoreth were coming, but they would find that the tide of humanity's rebellion had already begun to rise. The fight for freedom was no longer just an anthem. It was war. And this time the Atoreth would not silence humanity's voice. The dawn of the assault on Gorth Prime arrived with an eerie sense of finality. Elara stood at the command center, her eyes locked on the holographic display of the refinery complex. The once thriving industrial hub of the Atoreth now served as a symbol of their iron grip on the galaxy. Fuel, resources, and power flowed through its sprawling pipelines, feeding the war machine that had crushed so many worlds underfoot. Today, it would be the first target in humanity's counteroffensive. "You know what's at stake," Ryan said, his voice a steady reminder of the mission's gravity. His hands moved over the controls, directing the operation. "We take this refinery, and the Atoreth lose their main fuel supply. But we're not just taking a building, we're striking a blow to their entire war effort." Elara nodded, her throat tight as the weight of it all pressed down on her. The stakes had never been higher. The anthem had ignited something that could not be extinguished, but it had also painted a target on their backs. If they failed, humanity's fledgling rebellion would be crushed, and the Atoreth would strike back with unrelenting fury. "All systems are green," Corrin reported, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "The fleet's in position, and the first wave of rebels is on the ground. We're ready to go." Elara turned to face the assembled team. Each one had a role to play in this operation, but their shared resolve was the one constant. For every one of them, this fight was personal. For every life lost to the Atoreth, for every world subdued under their rule, they were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. "Then let's finish this," she said, her voice calm but fierce. "We move out in 5. The approach to Gorth Prime was fast, a blur of black void and flashing stars. The Resistance fleet, a ragtag assembly of commandeered ships, slid through the Atoreth's outer defenses with surprising precision. The bulk of the fleet was made up of rebel fighters and converted freighters, ships that had once been used to carry cargo and supplies, but had now been repurposed as instruments of war. They weren't designed for combat, but their crew had something that the Atoreth didn't, the fierce drive to fight for their freedom. Initial strikes are hitting their perimeter defenses. Ryan's voice came through the comms, clear and sharp. "Their shields are weakening. We've got a window." "Move in," Elara ordered. Her personal shuttle, a fast-moving vessel designed for stealth, raced toward the surface of Gorth Prime, its cloaking systems engaging to avoid detection. As they descended through the atmosphere, the refinery came into view, towering, metal-clad, and surrounded by a labyrinth of Atoreth-garbed posts and automated defenses. But what once seemed like an impenetrable fortress now seemed more like a challenge. "Ground teams are in position," Corrin reported, voice tight. "We're in." Elara's heart beat faster. This was it, the first major strike of the rebellion, the first real push for freedom. As the shuttle touched down in a secluded area near the refinery's control center, the doors hissed open, and Elara, along with Ryan and Corrin, emerged with the rest of their squad. The air on Gorth Prime was thick with the acrid scent of industrial waste and oil. The refinery's enormity loomed ahead, with massive pipelines stretching into the distance like mechanical veins. But there was no time to waste. The strike was underway, and every second they wasted could be the difference between success and disaster. The rebel soldiers, equipped with stolen Atoreth weapons and armor, moved with precision. They knew the importance of this mission. As they crept through the shadows, avoiding detection from the patrolling Xorith guards, Ilara couldn't help but feel the tension rising. Their plan hinged on hitting the core of the refinery, severing its fuel production and creating enough chaos to cripple the Xorith's war effort. But the deeper they moved into the heart of the refinery, the more the Xorith presence became apparent. Automated turrets whirred to life, and the unmistakable sound of combat filled the air. The resistance fighters responded quickly, their makeshift weapons cutting through the enemy forces with deadly precision. But there was no room for error. If the Xorith discovered their full force, it would mean the end of this mission. "Ilar, we've reached the central control room," Corrin said, his voice tight with urgency. "We're just a few meters away from the core." Ilara felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment. The future of the rebellion rested on their success. "Take it down," Ilara ordered. The final push had begun. And as the echoes of gunfire and explosions rang through the halls of Gorth Prime, Ilara knew one thing for sure. Humanity was no longer going to be silent. The fight for freedom had begun, and they would not stop until the Xorith Empire was nothing more than a memory. The heart of Gorth Prime's refinery shook with the force of explosions. It was as if the very foundation of the Xorith war machine was crumbling beneath them. Ilara's pulse raced as she and her team fought through the chaos, pushing forward toward the control core. The corridors were a war zone, resistance fighters clashing with Xorith soldiers, gunfire and explosions ripping through the air, the very ground trembling beneath their feet. "Ilara, we're almost there." Corrin's voice came through the comms, tense but resolute. "One more door, and we'll be in." The words ignited a fire within her, but she couldn't afford to get ahead of herself. The Xorith were everywhere now, their patrols more aggressive, their response faster. They knew something was wrong. They were on the verge of discovering the heart of the rebellion's plan, and if they did, everything they had fought for would be lost. "We're taking the core," Ilara said, her voice cold with determination. "This ends today." Ahead, the final door loomed, a massive blast door reinforced by layers of Xorith technology. It was meant to withstand direct strikes from their most powerful weapons, but not against the ingenuity of humanity. Corrin had already planted explosives around the perimeter. "Clear!" Corrin shouted. The explosion rang out like thunder, sending a wave of heat and shock through the corridor. The door buckled and twisted under the force, and the team rushed through, weapons raised. Inside, the control center was an imposing structure, glowing panels, humming machinery, and terminals that blinked with the pulse of the refinery's heart. A single Xorith officer stood before them, eyes wide in disbelief. "You, humans?" he hissed, his voice laced with contempt. Ilara didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she raised her weapon, the blast echoing through the chamber, and the officer fell silent. The moment was brief, but it carried with it the finality of their struggle. There was no going back now. Corrin moved quickly to a terminal, working furiously to override the system. "I've got it," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "This will sever the refinery's core systems. Without it, the Xorith won't be able to supply their fleet." As the countdown began, Ilara's thoughts turned to the fleet waiting above. The battle for Gorth Prime was only part of the plan. Above them, the Resistance's ships were engaging the Xorith forces in space, preventing reinforcements from reaching the refinery. But it all hinged on this final blow. If they failed to disrupt the core systems, all the sacrifices made so far would be for nothing. The terminal beeped. "It's done," Corrin said, his voice filled with triumph. "The core is severed. The refinery's production is destroyed. The Xoreth won't have the fuel to keep their fleet moving. Ilara exhaled, the tension flooding out of her. But she knew the war wasn't over. This was merely the beginning. "We've got one shot at this," Ilara said, turning to her team. "The Xoreth will retaliate in force. We need to get out now, before they realize what's happened." The team moved swiftly, retracing their steps through the refinery, avoiding further skirmishes. They had achieved the impossible, but the price had been steep. The resistance had lost fighters, their lives given freely to ensure this victory. But their sacrifice would not be in vain. As the shuttle soared through the atmosphere and back into space, Ilara looked at the starry expanse before them. The Xoreth fleet, once poised to crush them, was already in disarray, their fuel lines severed, their coordination shattered. The resistance had struck a decisive blow, but the war was far from over. And yet, as the stars glittered in the void, Ilara couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Humanity's anthem had not only echoed across the galaxy, it had resonated in the hearts of every soul willing to fight for a future of freedom. They had shown the galaxy that humanity would not be silenced, that humanity would stand. The war would continue, but now there was no turning back. And with that, the final verse of humanity's anthem rang out, louder than ever before, a promise that no force in the galaxy could ever extinguish. "We stand, we fight, we rise. Together, we will break the chains of the stars." And with that, the galaxy would never be the same again.